It's unsettling, isn't it? You read stuff like the EU telling people to get ready 72 hours of supplies, and you just can't help but think, what's on the horizon? What are they seeing?
Right. I mean, it's hard not to feel a bit on edge. And it makes sense, It makes sense that you and our listeners would pick up on this, all this information coming at us. Stuff like that EU announcement really makes you think about what's coming.
It does. It does. And that leads us right into what we're looking at today. A listener sent us these two, well, they sound like personal conversations, but really interesting ones. People talking about what's happening in the world, trying to figure out what it all means, trying to make sense of it all.
Yeah, yeah. And they're so honest, these conversations. You get a real sense of what people are thinking, how they're processing all this. So today, we're diving deep into them, really dissecting what they're saying, what they're predicting. We want to understand, where certain ideologies are converging, where powerful players are lining up, and most importantly, what it all means for you as you're trying to figure this out.
Okay, so that first audio. The person talking is worried right from the start. They're worried about these growing tensions globally. They use this boiling frog analogy, which, well, it just stuck with me. You get so used to things slowly changing that you don't realize how bad it is until it's too late.
Oh, that analogy is powerful, really powerful. It captures what a lot of people are feeling. Things are changing so gradually that we don't always see the big picture, not until it's too late. And that's a big lesson here, right? You've got to look for different viewpoints, make sure you're not just getting one side of the story. You could be missing something crucial. And this person, in that first audio, they're clearly afraid that's where we're headed, towards some kind of big conflict.
Yeah, and it wasn't just some vague fear. They actually talk about a full-blown war, even say world war. And they're worried about their kids, what kind of future their kids are going to have.
Hmm.
That's a lot to carry around.
It really is. You can hear that worry for the next generation, the genuine concern in their voice. It shows you how seriously they're taking all of this. And their point about the EU and the US potentially clashing, that's a huge deal. It challenges this whole post-World War II alliance structure that we've all come to rely on. Makes you wonder what happens if that falls apart.
And that led them to talk about having an escape plan, about moving to Portugal. Sounds like they've really thought this through. They like that the Portugals stayed neutral historically. Plus, they've got family there, property. They even talk about being self-sufficient, about farming.
Yeah, it speaks to this desire for safety, for a place that's stable, somewhere you can ride out the storm. And Portugal, with its neutrality, it makes sense, right? If you're trying to avoid getting pulled into a major conflict, Portugal seems like a good bet. And this emphasis on self-sufficiency, well, it tells you they're worried about things breaking down, about supply chains collapsing, everyday life becoming unreliable.
And they frame all this within this bigger idea, this notion of the U.S. empire declining, becoming decadent, the end of that post-World War II order, they call it. That's a pretty big statement.
It is. It is. It suggests that everything's shifting, that the balance of power in the world is changing fundamentally. They acknowledge what the U.S. has been, its influence, but they think it's fading. And this isn't coming out of nowhere. There are geopolitical experts saying the same thing, pointing to other powers rising, internal problems in the U.S.
They even talk about how globalization was almost like a deal, right? The U.S. provided security and in return got economic benefits. But now they feel like that's over, like playtime is over. And the U.S. might not be willing or able to step up for its allies like it used to. It really makes you think about how these international relationships work.
Absolutely. It challenges the whole foundation of the post-war world, what some call Pax Americana, that idea of the U.S. being the world's police force. It's being questioned, both from inside the U.S. and from other countries. And that shift, well, it could change everything, shake up alliances, throw security arrangements into chaos.
And then there's this really surprising thing they say. They talk about Spain ramping up its defense spending, getting closer to China. They even say, and I'm quoting here, I actually think that eventually, if mark my words, I think China will need China to save our butts. That's, well, that's a wild take.
It's definitely unexpected. It suggests that maybe we're looking at our alliances in a whole new way. They seem to be saying that in a world where power is more spread out, we'll see new partnerships forming, ones that are based on necessity, not ideology. Not so much an endorsement of China, but more like a realistic assessment of how power is shifting.
So putting all that together, that first audio is basically a big warning sign. They're worried, really worried that we're headed towards a world that's more chaotic, more dangerous.
Exactly. A world of escalating conflicts, U.S. influence fading, and this constant need to be ready for anything, for widespread instability.
Okay, on to the second audio, the longer one. And Right away, you can hear this sense of relief when they connect with the other person. Like they've been thinking, am I the only one seeing this? It really shows you how important it is to have someone to talk to, someone who gets it, especially when things feel so uncertain.
No question. When you're trying to wrap your head around something this complex, something that could be really unsettling, it's a huge relief to find someone who shares your observations. It helps you feel like you're not losing your mind, that you're seeing things clearly. This person, they clearly value that connection, that shared understanding.
And they immediately say that rational thinking, that's the key to understanding what's going on. Sounds like they really pride themselves on being analytical, on staying objective.
Yeah, that focus on rational analysis, that's at the core of how they see the world. They're saying even when things are scary, even when they challenge your beliefs, you have to look at them clearly, logically.
They then go into their background a bit, talking about being a home alone kid, being part of debating societies, working in finance, technology, and even geopolitics. It's almost like they're saying, here's why you should listen to me, here's why I know what I'm talking about. And it sounds like they've been paying attention to these trends for a while now.
It does. That background gives you context, helps you understand where they're coming from.
Mhm.
All those experiences in different fields, it probably helps them see the bigger picture, see how everything connects. And the fact that they were interested in these things even before the internet was everywhere, well, that tells you they have a long-term perspective, a more seasoned view.
Which brings us to the big question they ask, right? Are we headed for a big open conflict, a war? Or are we drifting towards something else, something they call a Cold War kind of fascism in Europe and the US? That's a pretty stark choice and not a very comforting one.
No, it's not. They're essentially laying out two paths, two really bad paths. One is all-out war. The other is this slow slide into authoritarianism, where governments become more controlling, more powerful. And along with that, we could see this resurgence of global tensions, kind of like the Cold War, but maybe even worse.
They also talk about the economy,
Yeah.
and they specifically say gold is a good investment right now. That feels like a classic move when things are uncertain.
It is. Gold has always been a safe bet when economies are shaky, when the world feels like it's on edge. And them saying this, well, it shows you they're worried about markets crashing, about people losing trust in the financial system.
And then they list all these things they wouldn't be surprised by. Markets tanking, civil war in the U.S., the EU pushing back against the U.S. It's like they've played out all these worst-case scenarios in their head.
It shows you how deep their concern runs, how many different ways they see things going wrong. And it's important to remember, they're not saying these things are definitely going to happen. It's more like, given what they're seeing, given how fragile things feel, they wouldn't be shocked if any of this went down.
They also talk about cryptocurrency, venture capital, AI disrupting all these business models.
Mm.
Seems like they see potential instability all over the place.
Yeah, they're a bit skeptical about cryptocurrency. Like, they're not sure it's going to hold up in the long run, especially with all these new regulations coming in. And their point about AI changing everything, especially software businesses, well, it makes you think about how fast technology is changing and how much disruption that's going to cause.
Then they shift gears, start talking about geopolitics. And while they don't really go into detail about specific conflicts, they say this is a very, very critical moment. You can hear the urgency in their voice.
That urgency, it tells you they believe we're at a turning point, a moment where everything could change, and those changes could last for a long time.
They even say that influential people are preparing for bad things to happen. They even mention Sam Altman specifically, saying he's a prepper. That's a pretty striking detail.
It is. The fact that people with power, people with access to information are getting ready for things to go south, well, it lends weight to their argument, doesn't it? It suggests that they're seeing real risks, risks that go beyond just general anxiety.
They also bring up Ray Dalio and his idea of stage 6 in the changing world order. It seems like they're seeing their own observations reflected in these bigger, broader analyses of how the world works. For our listeners, Ray Dalio's framework looks at these cycles in history, how power shifts between different countries and empires. And stage 6 is usually when you see internal conflicts, when people start questioning the whole system, the whole world order, which is
Brilliant.
exactly what we heard in our first audio, right?
Yeah, bringing up Ray Dalio is really helpful. It puts everything in context. It tells us that maybe all this chaos isn't random, that it's part of a bigger pattern, something that's happened before. Empires rise and fall, things change. It's a cycle.
Now, here's where things get really interesting. They start talking about two completely different visions of the future. On one side, you've got the World Economic Forum and their Great Reset. And on the other side, you've got this dark Enlightenment movement and the whole sovereign individual ideology. And they say that the sovereign individual stuff, That's what's driving the current U.S. administration. Okay, let's break this down for our listeners. What are we talking about here?
This is a big one. They're talking about two completely different ways the world could go. The World Economic Forum, with their Great Reset, they're talking about more centralized control, more global cooperation, a focus on sustainability and all things digital. But then you've got the Dark Enlightenment and the sovereign individual folks. And they're pushing back against that hard. Essentially, Dark Enlightenment thinkers reject modern democracy, the whole liberal system. They want to go back to older, more hierarchical ways of doing things. It's a challenge to everything we think we know about how society should work. And Sovereign Individual, it's a book from way back in the 90s, but it basically predicts that technology is going to make people more independent, free from governments and nation states.
And where does the current U.S. administration fit into all of this? Because they call them the lesser of two evils when it comes to avoiding a major conflict. That's a very specific take. What are they thinking?
It's complicated. They seem to be saying that even though they're worried about this administration's ideology, even though they see it as potentially dangerous, they think it might actually be preventing a bigger war from breaking out. They think the focus on national sovereignty, on putting America first, might be keeping things from boiling over right now. It's like they're saying, this might be bad, but the alternative could be much worse.
Then they talk about the UK and how they seem to be taking a more aggressive approach to the Ukraine conflict than the U.S. It sounds like they see some cracks in the Western alliance, some disagreements about how to handle things.
It does. It shows you that even within the West, there are different priorities, different strategies. They're seeing the UK as more willing to get involved, more assertive, while the US seems to be holding back a bit.
They also mention the Arctic and Greenland specifically. They say it's becoming more and more important strategically. It's a reminder that this geopolitical competition is happening everywhere, not just in one place.
Definitely. The Arctic is becoming a hot spot, no pun intended. It's got all these resources, and as the ice melts, it's opening up new shipping routes. And Greenland, right there in the middle of it all, well, that makes it a key piece on the chessboard.
Okay, let's dive deeper into these dark enlightenment and sovereign individual ideas.
Yeah.
The person in the audio says the current U.S. administration is putting these things into practice fast. They even recommend reading The Sovereign Individual to understand what's going on. So can you explain, what are these ideologies all about? What do they want?
We talked a bit about the sovereign individual earlier. It basically says that technology is going to empower individuals, make them less dependent on traditional governments. It's about people choosing where they want to live, who they want to be governed by. The Dark Enlightenment is a bit different. It's more about rejecting modern society as a whole, rejecting democracy and equality. They want to go back to older systems, systems that are more hierarchical, more traditional. And what the speaker is saying is that some of the things the current U.S. administration is doing, their policies, their rhetoric, it aligns with these ideas, this focus on national sovereignty, on deregulation, on being skeptical of global institutions. That's all straight out of the Dark Enlightenment playbook.
And then they bring up network states.
Yeah.
What is that, and how does it fit in with all of this?
Network states, it's this idea that in the future, political systems could be more decentralized, more fluid. People and communities forming their own networks, their own associations that could either exist alongside traditional nation states or even challenge them. And the speaker seems to be saying that the Dark Enlightenment could be seen as a more authoritarian version of this, where these networks are more controlled, more structured, while a more liberal interpretation of network states emphasizes individual freedom, voluntary association, maybe as a way to resist control from central governments, especially when you consider things like CBDCs. And for our listeners, CBDCs are basically digital versions of currencies, but they're issued and controlled directly by central banks. It's different from what you're doing now with your bank app. With CBDCs, governments could have much more direct control over your money, your finances, and that raises all sorts of concerns about privacy, about financial freedom, which is exactly what the speaker is worried about.
Right, and that ties into their whole point about the World Economic Forum and their 2030 allow nothing and be happy vision. They're saying that a lot of people, especially on the right, see that as a real threat. It paints a very clear picture of two very different futures, two very different ways of governing the world.
Exactly. It's a clash of ideologies. You've got people who want a more integrated world, a world managed by global institutions, and then you've got people who want the opposite, people who want more individual freedom, smaller governments, more control over their own lives. And that second group, that's where this dark enlightenment and sovereign individual stuff comes in. They're the ones pushing back against this Great Reset agenda.
And then they go into more detail about that right-leaning perspective, talking about individual self-determination, building things at the community level, and limiting government power. Sounds kind of like libertarianism, but maybe a bit different.
There are definitely some similarities to libertarianism, especially that emphasis on individual liberty, on keeping the government out of people's lives. But the Dark Enlightenment crowd, they tend to be more socially conservative, less into equality than your typical libertarian. So it's a bit more complicated than that.
They're really worried about AI and CBDCs, how those things could give governments too much power. They even say they're afraid of ending up with something like China in Europe or in the United States. That's a scary thought.
It is. They're talking about this rising tide of technological authoritarianism, where governments use technology to control their citizens, to monitor everything they do. They're worried about AI-powered surveillance, about CBDCs giving governments the ability to track every financial transaction. It's a future where freedom is eroded, where people are constantly watched and controlled, not a future anyone wants.
And then they talk about how tech companies, even Amazon, seem to be aligning themselves with the current U.S. administration. They even point to Meta moving to Texas as an example. It sounds like they see a connection there, some kind of shared interest or strategy.
They do. They see these tech companies, these giants, and they think they're betting on this administration, on this particular political climate. They see deregulation as being good for business, good for profits. And Meta moving to Texas, well, that's seen as a sign of the times. Texas has different laws, different regulations, and maybe Meta sees that as an advantage.
They use the word nihilism to describe what they're seeing, and they say the big question is whether all of this leads to violence, to open conflict, or to a different kind of authoritarianism, something that's not physical but just as oppressive. It's a pretty bleak view of where we're headed.
Nihilism. It's a heavy word. It suggests that things are falling apart, that people are losing faith in institutions, in values. And the speaker is saying that one way or another, this is going to lead to something bad. Either chaos and violence or a slow, suffocating control by powerful forces.
And they bring up this World Economic Forum report from 2021, the one that predicted civil unrest and attacks on tech companies. They even connected to Elon Musk and some of the things he's been doing. It's almost like they're seeing a self-fulfilling prophecy, like things are playing out exactly as predicted.
Yeah, it's like they're saying that the people in power, the ones pushing this agenda, they know it's going to cause problems, they know it's going to create instability, but they're doing it anyway. And they're probably prepared for the consequences. That mention of Elon Musk, well, it suggests that some of these tech leaders are anticipating big changes, maybe even profiting from them.
You really get this sense that there's a bigger agenda at play here, something going on behind the scenes. Like all of this isn't random, it's all part of a plan.
It's a common feeling when things are uncertain. People start looking for patterns, for explanations. They want to believe that someone is in control, that someone is pulling the strings. And the speaker, they clearly believe that's happening, that there are powerful forces directing things towards a specific outcome.
And then they talk about that Time magazine article and the announcement about the CBDC coin coming out in October. That seems to validate some of their concerns, especially about governments using CBDCs to control people.
It does. Those developments, they're taking those concerns from the fringes and putting them right into the mainstream. Now everyone's talking about CBDCs, about the potential for abuse, for government overreach. And the speaker, they're seeing it as confirmation that they were right to be worried all along.
They were actually surprised by the Tesla protests, almost like they expected a bigger reaction. It made them think that people like Elon Musk are anticipating these disruptions, and they're not really worried about them.
It's interesting, right? It suggests a disconnect between the public and the people in power. The speaker thought there would be more pushback, more anger. But maybe those in control, they know how to manage these things, how to control the narrative. Or maybe they just don't care.
One of their predictions is pretty scary. They say that all of this could end up provoking the left, leading to unrest, even civil war in the U.S. And they think the EU might end up supporting the left in that scenario.
Yeah, that's a really concerning scenario. They're basically saying that the current political trajectory in the U.S. could lead to a major internal conflict, a conflict that could draw in other countries, split the world along ideological lines. It's a reminder that all of this isn't just theoretical, it has real-world consequences.
But then they also say that maybe pushing things too far too fast isn't the best strategy. They say maybe the focus should be on improving the economy, on fixing things at home. It's almost like a call for moderation, for a more practical approach.
It is. It's like they're recognizing that change can be too much, too fast. that it can backfire, create more instability, more division. They're saying maybe we need to slow down, focus on the basics, make sure people are doing okay before we try to upend the whole system.
They even talk about the possibility of a new paradigm of governance, something beyond traditional democracy. It sounds like they think we might be on the verge of a fundamental shift in how societies are organized and governed.
It's a big idea, for sure. They're basically saying that democracy as we know it might not be the best way forward, that maybe we need something different, something that takes into account all these changes, all these new technologies and challenges. They don't say what that would look like, but they clearly believe that something big is coming.
And their advice to the EU and the UK, they say don't get into a conflict with Russia. Instead, focus on your own economies, build up your technology, find new partners in other parts of the world. It sounds like a more strategic, long-term view.
It does. It's like they're saying, pick your battles. Don't get bogged down in conflicts that might not be in your best interest. Focus on what you can control, on making yourself stronger, on building relationships with other powerful players. It's a more pragmatic approach, a more realistic assessment of where power lies in the world.
They paint this picture of a new world order, with these different blocs forming the US and Russia, aligning China on its own, the EU and Africa maybe teaming up. It's a very different world than the one we're used to.
It is. It's a world where the old alliances fall apart, where new ones emerge based on shared interests, shared goals. It's a world that's more complex, more unpredictable.
When they talk about preparing for the future, for potential threats, they mention another COVID-type event, or maybe even a black swan event, something completely unexpected that triggers major changes. And they say, remember that getaway plan to Portugal? It might come in handy.
Yeah, it's a reminder that no matter how much we analyze, no matter how much we try to predict the future, there's always going to be things we can't foresee. And those things, those unexpected events, they can change everything. So being prepared, having a plan B, well, it's not a bad idea.
And it was interesting how they talked about China, how they seem to see them as the ones to watch. Not necessarily because they like China, but just because they're seeing how much power China is gaining.
Right. It's not about ideology. It's about pragmatism.
Yeah.
They're recognizing that China is a major player on the world stage, a force to be reckoned with. And they're saying, whether we like it or not, we need to pay attention. We need to understand what China is doing and where they're going.
They talk about the decline of empires, how nothing lasts forever. And they seem to think the US and the EU, their time at the top, might be coming to an end. It echoes what we heard in that first audio, that sense that the old order is crumbling.
It does. It's a recurring theme, this idea that power is shifting, that the old hierarchies are breaking down. And it makes you wonder, what comes next? Who fills the void? Will it be a more chaotic world, a more dangerous world?
And then at the end, they bring up this idea of a type 1 civilization, the civilization that's united, that works together to solve problems and make things better for everyone. And they say that's not what they're seeing right now. Instead, they're worried about this trend towards technological authoritarianism, towards governments using technology to control people, to take away their freedom. It's a pretty stark contrast between this ideal future and this darker reality that they're seeing.
It is. It's a reminder that technology is a tool, and like any tool, it can be used for good or for evil. And the speaker is clearly worried that we're going down the wrong path, that we're letting fear and control dictate how we use technology.
So to wrap up, they're basically saying that we're at a major turning point, that things are going to be turbulent with economic instability, civil unrest, maybe even regional conflicts. They don't think it's going to be a full-blown world war, at least not yet. And they even offer some thoughts on places that might be relatively stable. Portugal, Switzerland, but it's expensive there. Spain, Brazil, Africa as a whole. But they're also saying that nowhere is completely safe, that there are risks everywhere, especially in America, Canada, and Europe.
It's a pretty sobering assessment. They're not sugarcoating things. They're saying the world is changing and it's not going to be easy. But they're also offering some hope, some ideas about how to navigate all this. It's up to each of us to decide what we're going to do, how we're going to prepare, how we're going to face the future.
So we've really gone deep here, haven't we? We've explored these two conversations, these raw, unfiltered perspectives on what's happening in the world. And it's clear there's this feeling that things are accelerating, that the world is becoming more unstable, more unpredictable. There are these powerful ideologies at play, like the Dark Enlightenment. And they're attracting powerful people, people who are shaping events, making decisions that affect all of us. And there's a real sense that things could get much worse, with civil unrest, a breakdown of the old order, a whole new world taking shape.
Absolutely. It's a lot to process. But it's important to engage with these ideas even if they're uncomfortable, even if they challenge our assumptions. Because the more we understand what's happening, the better prepared we'll be to face whatever comes next.
It makes you think, doesn't it? It makes you think about what you're going to do, how you're going to prepare. Because if these people are right, if things are going to get that bad, well, we all need to be ready.
We do. We need to be informed, we need to be prepared, and we need to be resilient. Because the world is changing and it's not going back to the way it was.
So here's a final thought for you, our listener. We've looked at these potential futures, these different paths the world could take. We've heard about these ideologies, these power struggles, these looming threats. Now the question is, what are you going to do about it? How are you going to protect yourself, your family, your community? And even more importantly, how are you going to help shape the future to make it a future worth living in? It's a big question, a challenging question. But it's one we all need to be asking ourselves right now.